This is the first time in human history where there are more overweight people walking the planet than underweight people. Our consumption of it is insidious, meaning it's just hidden everywhere. Your average adult today is consuming something like 77 grams of added sugar every single day. If you want to just like visualize that, that's almost 20 teaspoons of pure sugar.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't gotten asked that anywhere else. But the issue is
Sugar. I'm going to ask you if it's good or bad, and I'm asking that because I'm a Neanderthal and I just want things, a lot of my questions on this subject matter will be very simplified, and hopefully whoever's listening to this at home shares an equally primitive brain so I can be a bridge to them. But sugar, good or bad?
it depends.
I knew you were going to say that, and I knew it was a stupid question.
Well, that's the kind of answer that you should expect from somebody who really knows what they're talking about. The biggest problem, I think, today with regard to sugar is added sugar. So it's not sugar that's naturally found in food. All plant foods have some quantity of sugar. Even kale has a tiny amount of sugar. Mostly, you'll find it most concentrated in fruit, obviously, which is like the primary source of naturally occurring sugar in the produce section of the supermarket in whole fruit. But the most pernicious source of sugar today is the added sugar. The sugar that is added by food manufacturers to ultra processed foods, usually with the intent of making those foods hyper palatable. Basically, these foods, one of the major problems with most ultra processed foods is that they push your brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control becomes really difficult, if not altogether impossible.
I can relate.
Yeah, it's like the pint of ice cream, right? We've all had that experience of going over to the freezer, breaking out the pint of ice cream, flipping the top, taking a spoonful, only intending on having that spoonful. And then before you know it, you're looking at the bottom of the pint, right? I've been there. Everybody I know has been there. It's just, the problem is that people tend to think that it's a moral failure, right? That they screwed up when they're unable to moderate their consumption of those kinds of foods, whether it's ice cream or cupcakes or cookies or what have you. But the issue is, the real understanding here is that it's not a moral failure. We're designed to overconsume those foods because they light up fireworks in our brain's reward centers because they're so calorie dense. And now we live in a time where we've solved for the food scarcity problem, right? We have food overabundance. This is the first time in human history where there are more overweight people walking the planet than underweight people. So we've solved that issue. But our brains, they're still operating on version 1.0 of the operating system that told them that when we encountered sweet foods, or even savory foods for that matter, because salt is actually a very valuable nutrient as well, that we shouldn't stop consuming them because we don't know when the next feast is going to be, right? It was like there were periods of feast and famine. And so our brains and ultimately our palates and our, our willpower are doing exactly what they're programmed to do. So you're fighting against millennia, you're fighting against millions of years of evolution when you try to moderate your consumption of those foods. And I think that's the real problem with added sugar. We tend to overconsume it. We don't tire of eating it. It gives foods this quality of being hyper palatable. And it also has a number of, inconvenient, let's just say hormonal effects that when we really go overboard, aren't doing our health any favors. But for your average person today, we live in a world where, at least here in the United States, 1 in 2 people is trending towards obesity. Not just being overweight, but like obese, 1 in 2. So out of every other person, that person has clinical obesity. And 1 in 2 people also have some degree of glucose dysregulation. And glucose is essentially sugar. So for your average person, for most people today have some degree of metabolic dysfunction. The vast majority, in fact, do. And so for that person, sugar really is something, added sugar in particular, is something that really ought to be minimized, if not altogether avoided. Now, a little bit here and there, it's not going to be a problem. No single food can sway your health in any one direction, both either towards health or towards disease. But it's really, I think, important to be mindful of all of the many different places of added sugar in the modern food supply. The other problem, which isn't necessarily a health problem, but it's a problem with regard to dose, because as I mentioned, dose makes the poison. One of the biggest issues with added sugar is that our consumption of it is insidious, meaning it's just hidden everywhere. whether it's commercial bread products or sauces or sugar sweetened coffee drinks, we tend to just consume a ton of it. Your average adult today is consuming something like 77 grams of added sugar every single day. If you want to just like visualize that, that's almost 20 teaspoons of pure sugar.
Jesus Christ.
20 teaspoons of pure sugar. This is sugar extracted from the food matrix. So this isn't sugar in fruit. This is just the added sugar that we're consuming by way of these food-like products that Americans and Brits and people, increasingly around the world in developed societies are over-consuming today.
When I see, fizzy drinks that say they don't have sugar in them, or other things that say they're sugar-free, should I be skeptical? Because some of these things I'm eating this chocolate bar and I'm thinking this is too good. It says sugar-free or like really low sugar, but it just tastes like heaven.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't gotten asked that anywhere else. It's definitely worth talking about. So a lot of like sugar-free products today will use, there's a number of ways to make a product palatable and still say that there's no added sugar. So one way is manufacturers will use a compound called maltodextrin, which is essentially sugar. It's very sweet. It's technically a complex carbohydrate, so they don't have to list it as sugar, but it breaks down almost immediately into pure glucose. So it's actually a glucose polymer. So it's like molecules of glucose bound together in a way that's very easy for the body to break down. Other ways, they'll add fake fibers like chicory root fiber or tapioca starch fiber. The FDA is currently investigating whether or not these fibers, because the whole point of fiber is that we don't digest it. It's something that passes through us, maybe gets fermented by gut microbiota in our large intestine. But it's unclear as to whether or not these purported fibers actually act like fiber once in our bodies. And so overconsumption of those fibers can cause all kinds of digestive upset. A lot of people will get like incredibly bloated, like all kinds of inconvenient digestive issues when they overconsume them. And you'll see those a lot in like sugar-free products. Then you've got artificial sweeteners. You've got other non-caloric sweeteners like stevia, monk fruit. There are sugar alcohols, which sugar alcohols are an umbrella category. And underneath that umbrella, you've got sugar alcohols that I think are pretty good, actually, like erythritol and xylitol. And then you have others like maltitol and sorbitol, where if you overconsume those, again, more digestive upset. So you just really want to be careful with the non-caloric sweeteners that you're ingesting, making sure ultimately that you're not ingesting too much, particularly of like these fake fibers and some of the artificial or some of the, the sugar alcohols, because they can really wreck your gut.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.